Welcome to this session, and in this class we will have a slightly detailed discussion about Auguste Comte, who is widely considered as the father of sociology. In the previous class we discussed the contributions of Montesquieu and Saint-Simon as the social philosophers who laid the foundation or who contributed significantly for the emergence of sociology as a distinct social science. And by the time we come to Auguste Comte, we see that he has coined the term sociology, and then sociology emerged as a distinct discipline. It is been widely recognized or accepted as a new social science which with a very exclusive focal point, with an exclusive subject matter, and with a specific scientific methodology as a way of knowing about the society. So, in that sense, Auguste Comte is a very important scholar for the students of sociology, much more than the thinkers whom we discussed so far. So, this is his picture, and these are some of his very important works. He was an extensive writer, published extensively, and the course on positive philosophy which appeared in different volumes, and a discourse on the positive spirit published in 1844, a general view of positivism 1848, and religion of humanity 1856. So, he was born on 19th January 1798 and passed away on 5th September 1857, widely considered as the father of sociology, founder of positivism, and one of the early philosophers of science. And you know, this term father of sociology is a very problematic, it is a very oversimplified term, and by now I hope you would have understood that a person simply does not found a discipline, or you cannot really pinpoint a person to say that okay, he is the one who gave birth to a discipline. No disciplines simply take birth that way. You can't really give the credit for the birth of a discipline to one single individual. Even for the birth of a theory, it's very difficult to pinpoint a particular person, because none of these people work or live in vacuum. They synthesize, they engage in critical dialogue with their predecessors, they borrow a lot of ideas from the previous scholars, they revise them, they they have a very creative engagement with these things. So, to say that father of Auguste Comte is the father of sociology is a very oversimplified term. Of course, he is the one who coined this term sociology by combining this logos, socius and logos. But before that, as we had we discussed in the introductory class, there were social thinkers. For example, Ibn Khaldun is widely considered as by many people as the father of sociology, who provided very fascinating sociological analysis and experience as early as say 14th century in Arabia. So, but this is the kind of a common practice which been widely used. And he was also the founder of positivism. This is a very important argument. He is the one who is considered to be the father of positivism, a very powerful epistemological position, a very powerful methodological argument that sociology has to be, or sociology has to follow the path of the science, because it can study society by using scientific methods in an objective and unbiased manner. And the rise of positivism and the rise of anti-positivism. These are very fascinating methodological debates and discussions within the trajectory of sociology. And he was also, of course, one of the early philosophers of science who categorized science into different things, and who theorized about the relationship between methodology and theory. So, in that sense, Auguste Comte is a very profound thinker. And he was a very close companion of Saint-Simon. He worked as his secretary. At least for some 6 to 7 years, they collaborated very closely, and their ideas shaped each other's ideas very closely. But later they fell apart and they fought very bitterly, and their relationship ended in a very sore note. and Saint and Auguste Comte's personal life also was not very peaceful one. He suffered from mental illness. He was alone. He latter part of his life he got divorced from his first wife, and not a very pleasant personal life. And at present he is kind of considered to be a marginal influence in contemporary sociology because of this important arguments that society has to be seen as only as a positive one, and his many of his arguments are not really taken very seriously at present. Now we need to situate not only Comte but every important philosophers in their time and in their context. So as I just mentioned, no philosopher thinks simply out of the blue. Nobody gets enlightenment the way we conventionally understand the term, unlike say figures like Buddha or some other saints who gets an enlightenment all on a sudden or after so much of penance. That doesn't really work in the case of social scientists. They don't work in isolation. They have a very intense negotiations and engagement and conversations with the kind of ideas that are around them, the kind of scholars who are around them, and that ultimately leads to some kind of an original contribution from these scholars. So the kind of a intellectual context, the kind of socio-economic and political context, the cultural context of every social thinker is important. So in the coming classes as well, we will give or we will have to very carefully look at what were the kind of socio-economic and especially intellectual context for every scholar. And so his Comte's sociology emerged from the economic, political and social conditions of post-revolutionary France. And so that particular context, the immediate context of French Revolution played a very significant role in shaping the arguments of Auguste Comte. So we can broadly divide Comte's career into two phases: the early scientific stage where he argued persuasively for a science of society and was very famous in continental Europe for a brief time, and the latter part of his life where he tried to make science a new religion for the reconstruction of society. So these two phases are very evident, especially towards the latter part where he began to think about science as a religion for humanity. By the time he really suffered a lot of loss of credibility. Many of his followers discarded him, and people felt that he is moving into mysticism and he is kind of talking things which are not very coherent. So you see the kind of a downfall of a very important intellectual who was kind of celebrated at one point in time in Europe. So as we mentioned, Comte is considered to be the father of positivism, a very important methodological and epistemological stand in sociology. So positivism is a philosophical and epistemological foundation of sociology, must be understood in his larger scheme of things about the evolution of society through law of three stages. Comte, one of the most important contributions of Comte is his formulation of law of three stages, which we will briefly discuss. He argued that every society passes through these three distinct stages, from theological to metaphysical to positive. So his argument about positivism as a methodology, positivism as an epistemological orientation, has to be understood with his larger scheme of things, in which he argued that societies also pass through these three distinct stages. Positive in Comte's sense meant abandoning absolute for a relative truth and the search for the real nature of cause of things in favor of discovering laws defined as predictable regularities in the behavior of observable phenomena. And this is exactly a definition about science. You are trying to abandon, or you discard the absolute truth. You discard any absolutist truth. You look forward for relative truth which are established at a particular point in time. And this is one of the major differences between religion and science. Religion has an absolute explanation. Religion has an absolute explanation for almost every question. It has an absolute larger theory. So anything and everything that happens in this world can be explained on the basis of the will of the God. Whether it is the whole question about what happens after death, the whole idea of starting from such kind of questions, starting from questions like who created the universe, to questions like more philosophical questions like what is the purpose of life, or who am I, or what is supposed to be leading a good life. So religion is able to provide absolute, unambiguous answers to each and every of these questions, whereas science does not claim to, or science cannot do so. So he would argue that abandoning absolute for relative truth and the search for real nature of cause of things, he argued that it is very much possible. It is very much possible to establish causal links. It is very much possible to argue why certain things happen and what are the causal factors behind certain things. In favor of discovering laws defined as predictable regularities in the behavior of observable phenomena. So he would argue that positivism or the path of the science is to look forward for predictable regularities in the behavior of observable phenomena. You observe things, you collect facts, and once you analyze these facts, you will be able to see the kind of observable regularities, predictable regularities, which in turn gives rise to formulation of specific or codified laws. If it is true that every theory must be based on observed facts, it is equally true that facts cannot be observed without the guidance of some theories. Without such guidance, our facts would be desultory and fruitless. We could not retain them. For the most part, we would not even perceive them. And this is a very interesting point where he makes this connection between facts and theory. Whether it is a deductive approach or inductive approach, whether can we have a set of facts without theory, or can we have theory without facts. So he makes this point very clear that you need to have a set of facts, but these facts must be informed by larger theoretical argument. Otherwise, they become fruitless. They will not reveal any meaning. So he talks about the kind of a complementarity between theory and facts. And in his book, The Course of Positive Philosophy, Comte attempted to demonstrate that each science is necessarily dependent on previous science. That is, science can only be understood historically as the process of greater perfection. So he has this hierarchy of science, starting with the physics, astronomy, biology, and then finally reaching to sociology. A particular, as we mentioned, he is widely considered as one of the most important or one of the earliest philosophers of science. So he has his own argument about the complexity of a science and how that scientific method can be approached, scientific method can be used to understand complicated subject matters. So he argued that the final science which Comte claimed to have discovered and ones which had not yet entered his positive stage was sociology. It was sociology claimed that would give ultimate meaning to all other science. He argued that sociology is the mother of all sciences, a claim frankly which I do not think has any major validity or any major relevance now. But he argued that for example, in comparison with mathematics, where scientific principles can be used very easily compared to that of sociology, which deals a more kind of a complicated, unpredictable system. So he argued that in that sense, sociology really represents the most important feature of science. Comte proposed the word sociology for this new science rather than the current expression social physics. And we know that that is one of the reasons why Comte is considered as the father of sociology. He argued that this term sociology, the science of society, is better than the term social physics, the term that was currently used then during that particular time. So, another very important contribution which is very valid even today is to look at two distinct aspects of society. He argued that sociology was divided into two distinct parts. One is social statics, that is the study of socio-political systems related to their existing level of civilization, and secondly social dynamics, which entailed the study of three stages. So, this he argued that sociology is the study of two things. One is how social statics looks at how a society exists, what is the kind of a study of socio-political systems, socio-political structure of that particular society, and you are able to understand that particular society in relation to their existing level of civilization. So, you are able to identify, you are able to locate a particular society where it stands in the larger scheme of things, in the larger canvas of things. And then the second part is social dynamics, which tries to understand the social change. So, in other words, the social order and social change. Social statics looks at how the social structure is formed and where do you locate this particular society in the larger evolutionary scheme of things, and the social dynamics, the latter part of sociology, must look at how societies undergo change. So, this argument about a larger canvas of society, as is very evident, is one of the most central arguments of Comte, that every society has to undertake a unilinear evolutionary model, an evolutionary model in a single direction. Every society must follow this particular path, reaching a kind of a culmination. And for him, the Western countries, Western societies have already reached this particular culmination, because they were the so called positive societies. So, the attempt of Comte was to find the true scientific knowledge about the society, so that a balance between order and progress can be made and all conflicts, violence and confusion can be avoided. So, as we discussed briefly, Comte was a product of his time. He saw the kind of a confusion, he saw the kind of violence and unrest and social conflict that affected France during this post French Revolution era. So, he was deeply committed to bring in a more peaceful solution. So, he believed that the scientific knowledge will bring about a kind of a balance between order and progress. Very, very important concepts in sociology. On the one hand, you need stability. For stability, you need established institutions, you need a set of moral values, you need a set of practices which have certain kind of permanence. You need certain social structure, you need entrenched practices and entrenched value systems. On the other hand, society also requires progress, because French Revolution was seen as a very important milestone in the human progress, and it also opened up the possibility that the society can march forward to endless possibilities of progress. So, on the one hand, you require certain kind of an equilibrium, because a society without equilibrium, a society completely constantly in the state of chaos, could be quite detrimental. So, you need some kind of stability, and also you need the kind of a forward march towards what was generally understood as progress. So, how do you ensure that? So, he believed that the scientific knowledge provides you the mechanism to strike a balance between the social order and progress, and all conflicts, violence and confusion can be avoided. The tussle between advocates of reformists and the reactionary counter-reformists. And we know that the Europe during this particular time, there was very serious tussle, there was very serious conflict or arguments between the people who advocated more radical changes and the more reactionary conservative sections who wanted all these reformist attempts to be stopped and society retain its balance. So, he actually represents a very interesting position which tried to reconcile these two. Now, coming to his major contribution about this law of three stages, he claimed that the history of society could be divided into 3 different stages: the theological, metaphysical and positive, based on the evolution of philosophy and of human mind. So, it's a very interesting argument he makes. He argues that the evolution of philosophy and evolution of society and evolution of human mind, they all follow the kind of a similar pattern of a transformation from a stage that can be described as theological to an intermediary and a very short lived phase called as metaphysical, to that of a current stage that can be called as positive. And he was very favorable about it, he was very optimistic about it, and he had very positive opinion about this argument, and he believed that this is the law, because that is what the term the law. He is, as a social scientist, he is trying to copy, or he is trying to imitate the practices of natural science. He is trying to bring in laws of human society. And as you all must be knowing, now no social scientist would dare, especially sociologists, would dare to talk about formulating his of law of society as if something which is applicable to every society irrespective of time and place. Such overarching laws are impossible, they do not work, and sociologists have realized that it is impossible, or it is not needed, or it is irrelevant to try to create such kind of laws. But the times of Comte was very different, the intellectual orientation of Comte was very different. So, he believed that such laws can be formulated, because he wanted to model sociology after a physics or a chemistry, and he wanted to create laws of sociology the same way you have laws in physics and in chemistry. So, the first stage, the theological stage, relies on supernatural or religious explanations of the phenomena of human behavior, because the human mind, in its search for primary and final causes of phenomena, explains the apparent anomalies in the universe as interventions of supernatural agents. A very important argument. This his argument about law of 3 stages, even if we do not agree with the argument about law, but it is something very important, because it also talks about how human society in general began to make sense of the world. Because in this theological stage, as he correctly points out, human beings try to make sense of this world as a reflection of the actions and desires of a supernatural being. Whether you call it as a god, one god or several god, or whether you believe it in the power of spirits or certain kind of in phenomena like animism or animatism, you believed that the things that are going around you, the way in which the world works, work around you, the way in which human beings behave, the way in which everything happens around you must be regulated by a supernatural agent. And as human society progressed, your understanding of the supernatural agent also changed. From attributing divine power to a particular object, you usually understand it as animism, into some particular rock or a particular tree or a particular animal, to natural forces like thunder or rain, into different ideas about spirits, different notions of God, into more refined and more advanced notions of monotheistic religions, of a single God, the God which appears in the nature of human beings, or a God which does not have any shape. So, all these explanations were used to make sense of to make sense of the world around them, to explain the apparent anomalies in the universe as interventions of supernatural agents. So, anomalies, it could be anomaly in terms of your personal life, you being very pious and you being very leading a very virtuous life, but end up in facing some of the most difficult tragedies in your life. You do not come to terms with that. Starting from such kind of questions or such kind of agonies to your bewilderment about the way in which the world function, about natural calamities, everything was attributed to a supernatural agent. In this stage, humans focus on discovering absolute knowledge. Comte disapproves this stage because it turns to be simple explanation of humans created in their minds that all phenomena was caused by supernatural agents rather than human reason and experience. A very familiar argument that we have. You tend to believe what you simply thought in your mind, especially with the emergence of religion as an institutionalized system. There was mechanism to consolidate these ideas and to transmit these ideas and even to enforce that. So, every story of organized religion tells you the story of its codification, its institutionalization and its transmission, its socialization and its enforcement through violent as well as through non-violent means. So, every religious education, every religious institutions and in combination with the legal system and brute power, they worked across the ages. They happened across the ages to establish that the religious knowledge is the absolute one. But Comte believed that that is not true, because that is a reflection of a simple uncritical mind, and rather you need to employ reason and experience to make sense of the world. The theological stage is broken into three sections: fetishism, polytheism and monotheism, as an evolutionary progress. So, we just briefly mentioned that, because even in this theological stage human beings progress from understanding of attributing this supernatural spiritual things to certain objects, fetishism, into polytheism, believe in several gods, several forms of gods, and to monotheism. And even this is quite problematic in that sense, because he has this evolutionary character. He would argue that the most refined version of religion is that of monotheism, which again a problematic term. Then the second stage, metaphysical stage, is merely a modification of the first, because a supernatural cause is replaced by an abstract entity. People begin to think in terms of metaphysics, not proper philosophy, not proper theology, and it is meant to be a transitional stage where there is the belief that the abstract forces control the behavior of human beings. And Comte does not really elaborate this much. He argues that this is a very brief period, it is a very transitionary period, in spite of attributing the reasons to supernatural being or the supernatural power, you attribute that to abstract forces. Because theology and physics are so profoundly incompatible and their conceptions are so radically opposed in character, human intelligence must have a gradual transition. Very instructive argument. The theology and physics are so profoundly incompatible. He argued that you can't have a sudden shift from a theological frame of mind to a scientific frame of mind, because both work very differently. Both work very differently, both work on completely different premises, both have different kind of temperaments, or it requires different kind of temperaments, different kind of impact, both psychological and social and personal. So, you need a kind of a gradual transition, and he argued metaphysical stage provided that kind of a space. So, he argues that in the positive stage is when the mind realizes that laws exist to govern human behavior, and that this stage can be explained rationally with the use of reason and observation, both of which are used to study the social world. This stage relies on science, rational thought and empirical laws. So, this is the time when human beings say goodbye to all the theological explanation, all the knowledge that is supplied to them by the clergy, by the priests, which only requires your complete obedience and an acceptance. It does not require any critical faculty. You are not supposed to have a critical dialogue with your clergy or with your priest. You are supposed to completely accept the knowledge that is supplied to you as divine knowledge, and even criticizing the provider of this knowledge is seen as equivalent to criticizing the God. So, once knowledge is considered to be divine and the knowledge giver is considered to be divine, then it becomes very difficult to criticize. So, Comte argued that human civilization or human mind in their latter stage began to criticize or began to develop this faculty of criticism. They began to develop the faculty of reason. They began to believe that human beings have the ability, unlike other animals, unlike other living organisms, human beings have the ability to use their critical faculty to understand the world on their own. They are able to make use of observation, they are able to make use of their intelligence to make sense of the things that are happening around them. So, which through the rational thought they are able to formulate empirical laws. Comte believed that this study of sociology he created was the science that came after all others, and as the final science it must assume the task of coordinating the development of the whole knowledge, because it is organized of all human behavior. And this is what the point that we discussed briefly. He considers sociology as the mother of all social science. Sociology as, because since sociology developed at the last epoch, or sociology is the most recent science, it has all the features of all the sciences that were developed prior to that. It is able to synthesize all the scientific spirit that were developed previous to that. So, he argued that sociology must be able to develop that kind of a quality. It must emerge as the epitome of all the scientific qualities. And you know, as I just briefly mentioned, towards the latter part of his writing, he turned towards a kind of a mysticism, leaving behind his preoccupation with scientific inquiry and positivism, and leaving many of his supporters disappointed. So, he had a very difficult end, the end of a scholar who was once celebrated, who was considered to be very powerful in Europe, especially as he lived a very lonely life towards the end. But for sociology students, we understand Comte as not only as the father of sociology, not in a technical sense of the term as he is the one who coined the term, but he is the one who very profoundly argued for the emergence of sociology as a positive science, a strand of thinking which is even now very powerful. In the era of postmodernity or late modernity, there are very powerful stand of epistemological as well as methodological foundations within sociology who argues that sociology cannot let go its scientific character. Of course, there could be arguments and disagreements about what constitutes objectivity and other things, but there are scholars, or there is a very powerful school of thought which argues that sociology must retain its character of science, because these terms like objectivity and neutrality are not simply empty words, they need to be very seriously safeguarded. So, we will wind up this class on Auguste Comte, and we will discuss Herbert Spencer in the coming class. Thank you.